being mean to you.
Modern people today scoff at magic, and yet we have a gigantic portion of the population that believes that you can turn a man into a woman.
We've got some Anunnaki anarchy going on here. So this was the public sex ceremony where the priestess would...
Using honeypots, using honey traps to compromise powerful people, that's not a new idea. It goes back to the ancient world. So they want to push for this global technocratic Babel where everything becomes a big globo homo glob and everybody's sort of blended and mixed together and there's no unique people groups. Today we're going to be getting into some ancient mystery religion history with Babylon. And if you notice this week, there's a great conversation between our buddy Sam Tripoli and Alex Jones, and they talked about the way that today's system really is the same as the ancient pagan imperial systems with pagan religion, including the trans agenda, all of that, it all ties in together. And so Jamie's going to give us a bit of a history lesson today while I chime in and comment.
You hear a lot of people talk about the Babylonian Brotherhood and things like that. So I thought it would be fun for us to go back in time a little bit. And I read this chonker, The Babylonians, Folio Society by H.W.F. Saggs, and it was all about ancient Babylon and Assyria, their ways, practices, gods and goddesses, and all things Babylon. Along with that, we were reading this blubber book right here, Genesis and the Synchronized Biblically Endorsed Extra Biblical Texts. Now, I know these aren't canon, but they do reference them in scriptures. So this was really interesting because it went through Genesis, Enoch, Jasher, and Jubilees in chronological order. So it was filling in some gaps. So we've got some Anunnaki anarchy going on here.
Where do we begin? Babylon?
Well, the third book I was just going to mention real quick was Kingship and the Gods. And this is where it gets really crazy, because if you think history is dusty and boring, that is wrong, because it's very violent and sexy and bloody and scandalous. So are you prepared to learn about what ancient Babylon was like?
Yeah, we need to know, because again, we live in Babylon now. We talked about Hollywood Babylon. People have made that comparison. People like Kenneth Anger that were students of Crowley. He made a lot of avant-garde films, and I wrote 3 books, Esoteric Hollywood 1, 2, and 3, about the same kind of idea that we live in Babylon now. We're not free from the ancient pagan systems. The world system as it is now is the exact same. So tell us about Babylon.
Well, it seems like piecing together all of these different narratives and the Greek history, the Mesopotamian history, the biblical Israelite history. So we're trying to put together a puzzle with a lot of different pieces, right? Historically. Before the flood, there were the Watchers who fell and had a hybridization of humanity. So you've got Genesis 6, you've got them building these cities that happened before the flood that they found later on. So you have Eridu, you have Uruk, Babylon, these types of cities that were inhabited by beings. I know this is weird, but it's all in the history.
The gods.
Yeah, the gods. And so each god or demigod had its own city, and Babylon was one of them. So Inanna had Uruk, Enki had Eridu. And after the flood, these civilizations were wiped out. These beings that did hybridization, they were punished and cast out or turned somewhere else. And the cities were now empty, but they had to be populated again after the flood. And this is where you get priestcrafts that have to mimic the sort of supernatural powers and technological advancements that these gods had pre-flood.
Right. Genesis 6 is citing the Book of Enoch, which talks about this weird hybridization and this idea that there was the offspring of the sons of God, supposedly the angels that fell. This is one of the possible ways of reading. There's other people that read it in terms of it being important men in history, key figures. Hercules was actually just a dude, not a god, that kind of stuff. So there's different ways to read these texts, but the way that a lot of the Old Testament texts, the deuterocanonical texts, for example, the Book of Judith and others, they actually read it as this is where we got the myth of the Titans. So there is biblical credence, not just in Jude 3 in the Book of Enoch, but in other places for this idea.
And we are seeing 3 distinct languages coming out in the very beginning of history. We have Sumerian and we have Hebrew, which is very ancient, and also some kind of mystery language. And we also have the migration of the Amorites, which are talked about in the Bible, right? So these were the giants after the flood.
Mhm.
And it's interesting that the epics, where we get a lot of this history, Epic of Gilgamesh and things like that, he was one of the first, like you would say, superheroes,
Mhm.
right? So you have this continuation of the Marvel,
Mhm.
Thor, all of these gods. I can't imagine them not making a Gilgamesh movie in the future, maybe. What do you think?
But it's not popular enough,
Oh, okay.
and it's not gay enough.
So
Like, does he touch butts? That's all that really matters. That's the only thing that matters, and all that ever matters is that. But go ahead.
there is a lot of that going on
I know.
in this, because that's where you get into goddess worship. So a lot of people think that, a matriarchy or some kind of goddess worshiping culture is just, like pregnant ladies sitting on lounge chairs being fanned by palm leaves and fed grapes. And no, it is temple prostitution. One of the practices of the Babylonians, and this was ubiquitous everywhere in the ancient world all the way up until Christendom, is the practice of leaving your infant out to exposure, right?
Yeah.
So, we have this big problem today with abortion, but in the ancient world, it was it was the patriarchal family actually who would decide if we had too many girls, if they didn't like the way the baby looked, if it was deformed, they would say no, and they would just leave it outside the city. And this,
Which still exists in some places today.
this was super normalized until after the incarnation.
Speaking of that, in the book of Numbers, there's this story where the Israelites are tempted with, they call it Baal Peor. And if you understand what that means in the Hebrew, that's referring to a situation. It's called Lord of the Open Holes. So this is a deity that's worshipped that has to do with bodily parts and body fluids. And this is, again, it sounds really gross, but that's exactly the type of sort of focus of our culture today, the way that it's gone with this Babylonian emphasis. It's nothing new. It's an ancient religion that's still here.
And this comes from a distinct race, or like a lineage of people after the flood that still had some kind of genetic, what would you call it?
It's called gigantism.
Yeah. So they were also very wild. You have the Akkadians. So you have Babylon and Akkadia always warring against each other. So the whole world is like city-states who worship their cult god, and those go to war for each other and against each other.
Yeah, like Babel. Babel was the attempt at a first world government.
Right. So after these main gods have departed, you have the priestcraft trying to control the city with prestidigitation instead of this advanced technology of the Nephilim, right? Or the Watchers, I would say.
Yeah, so sleight of hand.
Yeah. So that's when you get to these books like Bel and the Dragon of Daniel. Can you explain that real quick while I look?
Yeah, so this is a deuterocanonical section that's in the Orthodox and Catholic Bible in the book of Daniel. It's called Bel and the Dragon, and it's a story where Daniel exposes some of the pagan priests for rigging up this mechanical deity that people thought was a real deity, but it was actually just a mechanism. So the Bible actually debunks some of the superstition and fraud in the religious realm as well.
So it's really interesting, where does the concept of kings and kingship come from? And it comes from prehistory, and it also comes from the union of a mortal with the goddess Inanna.
Mm-hmm.
And we can get to that like in detail a little bit later, but I just kind of wanted to, let's see, the sacred marriage.
Is this the idea of you have to unite with the deity through some sort of religious ceremony?
Well, and this is where we get the idea of play acting, actors, actresses, invoking the god to be inside them so that they can be the rulers over the city. And so the male figure that the king would be performing is Dumuzi or Tammuz, which is also mentioned in the Bible, where they say, do not weep for Tammuz, because this was a scene from Babylonian religion, right? So you've got these epics, you've got Gilgamesh, you've got these kings, and their primitive concept of justice is very interesting because it was this accepted responsibility of the king and referred to the economic justice for the king to set forth in the land involving some kind of moratorium or remission or forgiveness of debts. So even back then, in the very beginning of time, they had money lending, and this led to a lot of inequalities, and you could not get up in life, or your children couldn't get up in life if you owed a bunch of money. So one of the first responsibilities of the kings in Babylon was to have a sort of, what is it called, jubilee, or
in the Bible, it's called Jubilee, which is the period when you forgive debts.
Because each city was basically a temple estate that was subject to the king, but ultimately the god, and everything was owned by the temple complex. Mm-hmm. And everyone just paid tribute and tax to it. So one way to think of it is everyone is slaves to the god, and they bestow basically based on their whim. Mm-hmm. If you supplicate them enough, or if you don't, they will smite you. And it's a lot like how Muslims think of Allah as you are their slave. And even in some of their historical writings, they say these gods created us to be their slaves, specifically, right?
Which is interesting because that fits with an imperial religion where the emperor is the god on earth, right? So then everybody else would be sort of the slave caste or class. And these are caste systems, of course.
The temple is the heart of the economy. That's very important to just the entire status quo and structure of the whole thing is worshiping these pagan deities, right? So you have all of these groups of people. You have magicians, you have witch doctors, you have priests, and there is an entire economy revolving around like witchcraft was against the law mostly, and that's like cursing people, but you could hire the good shaman to come and take the curse off you. So there's this...
So it's a racket, basically.
Yes. Exactly. There's a racket, there's the witch doctor, and then there's the good one who will come and remove the curse for a fee, right? They're extremely superstitious, but not to say that supernatural things weren't happening, but they were on top of that, they were also extremely superstitious. Like they would think that cause and effect, like one day it rained and my dog died. That means like if it rains, your dog's going to die or something. So that this is like the type of rationale that they're having. So because of that, they are relying a lot on omens and signs and symbols. So one of the three main types of divination was reading animal entrails. Mm-hmm. Right?
They were clever enough back at that time that the state understood that if they control the religion, they can control the society. And so the statists have always sort of had this attitude that they could control everything with specifically occultists. And if you could make the cult worship the emperor, that was the best means of control. And most of those ancient pagan empires, isn't it fascinating that they all had this worship of the emperor? And I think that suggests that there's a common pattern here, not just of human cunning, but also something demonic going on. Why would all these empires collate and sort of synthesize and bring all their power to a central location in these megacities if that wasn't because of some sort of pattern of human depravity and our fallen nature? And I think the same thing is happening today, where we're having this move from the idea of multiple states, multipolarity. They want to push for this global technocratic Babel where everything becomes a big globo homo glob and everybody's sort of blended and mixed together, and there's no unique people groups. Remember, in the book of Genesis, God created the people groups to be specific people groups. He didn't want Babel where everybody was just sort of melded into one gigantic, glob thing. So these religions, these imperial powers in the past are patterns and structures that I think the wicked use and study to bring into today. In fact, you can look at, famous historical texts like Oswald Spengler's book, Decline of the West. That 2-volume series was written as a critique of some of the flaws and the patterns that Spengler saw in the West, because he saw that civilizations and societies had a lifespan. And so they would have a birth, kind of an ascent, a flourishing, and then they have a death phase. But when people at Tavistock when they read Spangler's Decline of the West, they realized that it could also be understood as a manual of how to degrade and destroy, and kind of through a form of accelerationism, you could say that Tavistock kind of came up with that. You could further the collapse of the old system to bring in the new system, which again is this sort of technocratic socialist order that they've been pushing.
Well, they kind of want it set up, the way I see it, is these city states, right? That are sort of like
mega cities.
Mega city states, that you are a citizen of this and not of the land that you're on. So we'll see how it goes.
Well, that's getting rid of the nations, getting rid of nation states and borders, and having a gigantic federation of megacities is exactly the kind of rootless bugman future that they want.
Mm-hmm. So I thought when we were doing that show with Isaac Weishaupt the other day, we came across this quote in a Kenneth Grant book saying that Crowley and the beings that he was in contact with were the same as these beings in ancient Mesopotamia.
Yeah, the same demons.
Yeah. Pazuzu is named in here, so that's the famous
the exorcist
demon, right? Mm-hmm. The demon of the hot wind of the desert. And what they would do is actually just make an amulet of the thing that they were scared of for some reason. So I don't know like how that tracks logically, but if you carry around a mini form, it will protect you from the actual thing.
Yeah, which is interesting because you see that in Judaism as well, with Babylonian Talmudic religion and the idea of, within the Kabbalah, for example, a lot of sigils and amulets. So I think a lot of this, when the Jews were in Babylon, did pass into some of that oral tradition.
Mm-hmm. So another type of demon of Babylon would be Lamashtu, who made an appearance on Saturday Night Live last year in a sketch. Lamashtu is the she-demon who threatens nursing mothers. So kind of like a Lilith or something.
Lilith, yeah.
Then you have the good spirits and the winged bulls, and not to be confused with the Lamassu. So do you remember we went to London to the British Museum and those gigantic winged guys? So those are the Lamassu, these guys.
So griffins, basically.
Yeah, these protective guys. So they had classes, different classes of spirits, and some were bad, some were good, some need to be supplicated.
We're full Harry Potter here.
Yes, this is Hogwarts right now. But I mean, this is Techno-Babylon in a way. We just did a show called that. So it's all going to make sense. If we have enough time, we get to goddess worship and transgender.
Mm-hmm.
So back then, the pantheon was just like, Anu, Enki, Enlil, Inanna. Mm-hmm. These also have Greek names. Ovanes is one of them. And they're thinking that a lot of the technology that came to them was from a fishman, right, named Enki. And he was like, the water god who came to be Triton or Neptune, those guys, right?
The ancient empires tend to have the same basic gods, right? So you have within Egypt, like certain deities associated with Heliopolis, and there's like 10 deities, and then eventually it's 11 or 12. And then, so that pantheon, which gets associated with the zodiac and the houses of the zodiac, it's all the same sorts of patterns from these ancient civilizations up through to the Romans, to the Greeks and then Romans, etc.
Mm-hmm. And this is something that the prophets of Israel were fighting against when they were captured. The Babylonians were trying to fold in Yahweh into their pantheon and identify him with Marduk. And so this is something that the prophets were.
Yeah, the whole book of Jeremiah is set within, him lamenting and prophesying about the Babylonian captivity. And so many of the things that he talks about, not just with Babylon, but even the whole book itself, he critiques at that time even the problem that the scribes and the lawyers in Israel had already begun importing a lot of these bogus traditions and teachings of men and superstitions, and something that Jeremiah rebukes, which leads him to be imprisoned, and he's let down into a pit. And that, by the way, is all a type of Christ, because when you read in the Gospels, Jesus starts talking about being the good shepherd and things like that in the book of John. That's all parallel to the whole shepherd discourse in the book of Jeremiah. So there's so many things in Jeremiah that parallel the contemporary time of Christ, including the fact that Babylon is likened to Rome, and the fall of the Jewish temple and so forth to the Babylonians is a type of the fall of the temple in 70 AD, which Christ predicts in Luke 21 and Matthew 24. So all of what we're talking about, we're kind of moving up into the apostolic period, to the time of the apostles, et cetera. And so it's going to be very relevant to where we are today, because this same principle, this idea of this world civilization antithetical to God, right? Remember in the story of the Tower of Babel, the idea is to build this human civilization, this tribute to man, to autonomous man, in defiance of God, that they didn't think they could really go into heaven. But the idea is to defy God. Babel is really an archetype and a pattern for everything playing up to where we are today, whether it's culture, whether it's technology, whether it's religion. Babylon is the ethos that we are entering into. And so the book of Revelation, when it describes the end era, the last days, it describes it as a religion of mystery Babylon, the whore, that seeks to unite all the nations in a false worship and degeneracy, et cetera. So how do we make sense of this? What's the origin of all this? Where does it come from? We would say that it's a fallen angelic entity. It's satanic. And it's never gone away. It's still here, and it won't go away until the end of the world, until the eschaton. And so we were talking about these patterns and the symbols, the symbology of this religion and how it relates to today, particularly things like Hollywood. Hollywood is really just the new Babylon. I wrote 3 books on this. You can get those books at my website, jaysanalysis.com, in the shop. All those are signed copies, and also you can get copies of Jamie's books on the same subjects.
By assimilating the personality and function of a lot of other goddesses, including Mother Earth. And that's a weird one that I did not expect. So the Mother Earth of the New Age is also this Inanna goddess, right? So she eventually became virtually the only female deity, so that the word Ishtar came to be used for goddess in general. And her formidable power is reflected in the mythological fantasy that she drove a team of 7 harnessed lions, or 7 evil winds. And so that's the imagery that we were using for the Katy Perry Super Bowl, right? Her on top of a lion with this flaming dress. And I want to show you guys this.
Yeah, I mean, pop music is full of this stuff too, for sure.
Yes. So this is the Ishtar Gate. Where's the camera? Right there.
Mm-hmm.
You can see that the blue Ishtar Gate of Babylon right there. And right now that is in a museum in Berlin, which is called the Pergamon, which is named after this temple to Zeus. They also discovered and brought that to the city of Berlin.
I think it visited the Vatican and then it went to Berlin or somewhere, but
right, which the Bible calls the seat of Satan, actually.
Yeah, in the book of Revelation early on, when John's writing the letters to the 7 churches, the church of Pergamos is called the seat of Satan.
Mm-hmm. And in the very same museum, you have this literal of Babylon. So Ishtar is known as a gate also. This is the Ishtar Gate. She is the portal through which a lot of these cosmic currents that the magicians would say in their vernacular come through, right? Mm-hmm. She becomes Diana's, who's the major one? A lot about, I think we did a show on Sibylle when we were talking about self-harm and cross-dressing, right? Okay.
Well, what's interesting is that the ancient religions, through these goddesses and gods and the idea of the hermaphrodite, which now we call Baphomet or whatever, that these ancient religions actually had guilds of trans prostitutes that would promote this stuff.
Yeah, they were called the Gali or the Gali or the Gala. And yeah, they were her priests in communal setup. They were beggars. They were entertainers. They were traveling wheelbarrows, go from town to town and do signs.
And they lived on welfare.
Yes, well, welfare and like alms and cut themselves. They would give concerts. So they were like a whole thing, right? We did a whole show on that. But yeah, she was actually in her epic poems. She says, I, Inanna, am the goddess who can turn men into women and women into men. Right?
That's a powerful magic there to be able to do that. And but see, modern people today scoff at magic, and yet we have a gigantic portion of the population that believes that you can turn a man into a woman. So all the left actually does believe in magic. They have absolutely 100% magical thinking. In fact, Terence McKenna used to critique this and talk about this. I'm not a fan of Terence McKenna, but he would say that we have entered into an era now where we have magical thinking as the norm, and that's what postmodernism is, this idea that you can think reality into being. So if I identify my mind as a woman, I am therefore a woman. So this is all just really lunacy, as it's almost kind of a form of mass, I don't want to say mass formation psychosis, but mass schizophrenia, because people are actually becoming dissociative, it would seem. And I know that in the John Mark's book on the history of the Manchurian Candidate MK Ultra study stuff, he actually argues that there was an intentional study and plan to understand how to induce dissociation. I suspect that they actually probably want to cause dissociation in the populace. And when we look at the leftists today, how they act like just sort of mobs of, Babylonian mind bombed, demon possessed people, like they're actually in some sort of mind dissociative state.
Well, you see, like on National Geographic or whatever, the people who will go out and drums and pierce themselves or like stick a thing through their tongue and not bleed. So these are the types of mystic shows that they're putting on in Babylon.
Like voodoo. Sometimes in voodoo, you have to engage in really extreme forms of self-torture or harm, and then that placates or causes the deity to enter into you. Mm-hmm. But it's also a performance, because if you ever watch like Vodun ceremonies, the shaman's also a performer.
Right. And so the association with whoredom and Babylon is very ubiquitous and well documented. So here it says, classical tradition certainly believed that religious prostitution took place in association with Babylonian temples. The Greek traveler Herodotus reports in Babylon, every woman must... Herodotus? I did a... You know who? Herodotus. Okay, every woman must...
It's architecture. It's pronounced architecture. And don't get into the macabre.
It's nuclear. Go nuclear. Every woman must once in her life...
You need a green beret in your hair.
Go and sit in the temple of Aphrodite and there have intercourse with a stranger. Once a woman has taken her seat, she may not return home until some stranger has cast a silver coin into her lap and taken her outside the temple to lie with her. As he throws the coin, the stranger has to say, in the name of the goddess Mylitta. When she has surrendered herself, her duty to the goddess has been rendered, and she may return home. From that time, it will be impossible to seduce her, no matter how large a sum you offer her. So these are just some of the tales of traveling through Babylonia as an ancient Greek, where they're still doing this temple prostitution.
Yep, little St. James. I don't think it's a temple, but it looks kind of like a temple. I don't exactly know what that building was. Maybe a spa, a sauna, but it could have been a temple, right? It could be some kind of, Crowleyan style temple. We don't really know, but you see this stuff not just with Epstein, but, you see it with Savile and all of these, pretty prominent human cases. Think of the Dutroux affair in Belgium, where you had women that were held captive in a castle, and some of them escaped, and ratted on basically the entire structure of the Belgian government, and basically nobody got in trouble. So they only went after the patsy, the guy who was the procurer, Marc Dutroux. But this shows us that, you have an entire European state back in the 90s, 2000s that was implicated, including a Roman Catholic cardinal. It went all the way up to the top of the elites of that society, and they were just really completely just degenerate, predatory sickos. So that's kind of what we're getting at here, is like with a lot of these high profile cases with Epstein, although I don't know about any specific satanic stuff, in the case of Wexner, Leslie Wexner does talk about being possessed by a Dybbuk. So even within the Epstein sphere, there is the idea of demonic possession. I know Epstein was interested in, transhumanist type things and having offspring and so forth that he could, populate the future with his own, Epsteinian race or whatever. But that stuff, it's exactly what we're talking about. It's this domain of the religious, the scientific, the esoteric, all sort of colliding with, intelligence agencies and compromise. And it's an ancient technique. There's a great book that I've been meaning to get to for a long time, written by an intelligence historian who was a Roman Catholic Uniate priest, Francis Dvorak, and he wrote a book about the history of intelligence agencies in the ancient and medieval world. And we don't think of that as, you don't think of that in the ancient world. You think of priests and, emperors, but they actually had a very sophisticated network of espionage and spycraft and entrapment operations, using honeypots, using honey traps to compromise powerful people. That's not a new idea. It goes back to the ancient world. So again, in regard to this idea of the history of intelligence agencies overlapping with religions, the original spies were priests and were mailmen, according to Francis Dvorak in his history of intelligence operations. So you can go back to the ancient Egyptian world or to Babylonian world. And it was the priestcraft that was also the spies. It was the priestcraft that was also basically mind controlling people. They had the technology, even in ancient Egypt, of potentially sort of putting spells on people using, magic, using potions, using this kind of stuff. You see this in the book of Exodus itself, right? With Pharaoh and his magicians and the religion of Egypt versus, Moses and so forth. So this is a spiritual war and confrontation that's not new. It's ancient and it's still going on.
I have an article coming out with the Decoding Culture Foundation, and it's all about Pinocchio and mystery religions and how many different esoteric interpretations there are of just that little cartoon. But in studying for that, I actually found what the Epes temple was built after. And
it looks like a Turkish bathhouse, like a Syrian bathhouse.
A bathhouse in Aleppo, Syria, Islamic bathhouse. And it's done in a very distinct style. I can't remember the actual name of this specific Muslim architecture, but it is a bathhouse in Aleppo. Very ancient one. So that's weird. Cross-dressing. What else? Invoking a god into a statue. So this is a very interesting study. Are spirits made of matter, and can they be trapped in things? So the Babylonians thought that they could, and some new techno-pagans also think that this...
Annabelle.
What do you think?
That's about Annabelle.
Yeah.
That doll, crazy. That doll scared me.
So they did actually believe that you could trap a spirit in an object, sort of like a genie in a bottle, and worship that and get that to do things for you. Also, before and after the flood, these cities, the feeding of the gods was a huge endeavor. Like the first cuneiform seals that they found were just like record keeping of the taxes that you would bring as tribute to the temple, right? And it was like so much food, wealth. The priests could never even eat it all. And so it could be that like before the flood, these bigger beings were consuming all of this stuff. Even they say that in the Bible, like they were eating everything in the land. And the Epic of Gilgamesh was saying they were eating everything.
It's not in the Bible. It's the book of Enoch that says that.
When they go to, spies of Joshua go to visit, and they say that they eat everything. So
I thought you were talking about the Nephilim. I mean, it's not the Nephilim that Caleb sees, but go ahead.
No, but I'm just saying like the tribute to the temple is enormous, right?
Yeah, right.
Okay. And it just required most of your...
Well, I mean, at times it requires your firstborn.
Yeah, so that was super common, just to take your first baby and give it to Moloch, because then you would have 10 more babies.
Yeah, and we know that there was going around on TikTok last year, some of our friends like Dr. David Patrick Harry, Rachel Wilson, and others did a whole series of talks and podcasts on this idea that there's girls on TikTok now that are actually promoting the idea that you can have abortion as a kind of a ritual, magical Wiccan action. And this kind of went viral for a while on TikTok. So if you think that the Babylon mystery religion is gone, no, it's actually being promoted by, TikTokers and witch talk, so to speak. Do you remember that when they were saying that you can abort your firstborn as an offering? And some of these videos were getting, hundreds of thousands of views, millions of views. It was crazy. There
was a article in was it Cosmopolitan or something like that?
Yeah, I shared that it was Cosmo, I think.
Yeah. So yeah, Babylon 2.0, or however you want to call it. In the new year, they would have the Akitu Festival. So this was the public ceremony where the priestess would represent the goddess, and she would bestow the kingship onto the king in public. And the people would emulate this, and this was an entire public fertility ritual. So this is what's going on in ancient Babylon as worship is these.
Yeah, it makes me think of that movie Wicker Man with Christopher Lee,
Exactly.
where, in Wicker Man, they're basically having to continue the human sacrifice because they think that that placates the deity to then make the crops grow again. But of course, we all know that the best Wicker Man is the Nick Cage Wicker Man.
And I find it so interesting that this whole package came as a lump thing, like the idea of a crown, of a scepter, of a throne, all of these royal implements. They're probably stolen from heaven.
Yeah, well, they're stolen from the prophesy. In Genesis 49, you have a prophecy of the scepter will not depart from the tribe of Judah until Shiloh comes, and Shiloh is the Messiah. So when the Messiah comes, that's it. Like, there's no more Davidic line because, that's a mysterious prophecy. How do we get the scepter departing, right, when the Messiah comes? Well, Messiah is the final member of the Davidic line. And so that's Genesis, right? So a lot of people think that, the Bible is against kings. The Bible, Samuel is warns the people that it's a king after the pagans, right? The pagans worship the king as God on earth. And in this situation, it's unique. It's a different situation where the Messiah is actually prophet, priest, and king. He fulfills those three roles of the Old Testament. And so this is the unique situation where Christ, who is the Messiah, who is the Son of God, he is the one to be worshiped. Whereas in these other situations, it's facsimiles and fakes and frauds, right? Pharaoh, he's not really the Son of God. Enki, he's not really a deity or whatever, right? The, Cyrus, right? He's a type of the Messiah, but he's not the Messiah. So in the same way as you have these fake versions, there's also the authentic version. But in regards to monarchy and kingship, people don't realize that in the book of Deuteronomy, Moses laid down laws for the king. You have a prophecy of a monarchical lineage through David in Genesis 49. So how could the Bible be against kings and monarchs when throughout the Old Testament, prior to even the Davidic kingdom, you had the prophecies and you had the restrictions on the king? For example, the king was supposed to read the law all the time. That's in the Mosaic law itself. So how could it be against monarchy when that's in the Torah itself? But the point is rather that people have a tendency to worship these figures and to defer to them and to make them into deities when they're not actually deities. And that's the danger. That's the facsimile fraud version that you get in all these mystery religions.
Also, it's interesting that the Israelites had no king up until Saul, while all of these other dynasties, monarchies, Sumerian kings list are getting their legitimacy from these fallen angels or rituals done in votive.
So they say.
Right. And Israel is like a distinct set apart thing. Like, we don't get a king that has, had sex on top of a ziggurat with Inanna, right?
Well, except that most of the Israelite kings fell into that. So basically, there was only a handful of good kings in the southern kingdom of Judah, and all the kings of the northern tribes of Israel were bad.
Because that it wasn't just Mesopotamia, it was also Egypt. So this book is paralleling the mystery plays of Egyptian with Babylon and saying they also have these rituals that they get their legitimacy to rule from the priest and the goddess, and therefore become the god on earth. Like, the Pharaoh would be Ra on earth. And within all of this, you have just so much human sacrifice going on. It's not just people play acting, LARPing. They're literally shedding blood of people. I mean, just the amount of different types of human sacrifice is kind of chilling when you read these ancient texts, because you have the widow sacrifice, right? If a powerful man died, his wife was expected to just sacrifice herself and maybe her family too, to just go in there with them. You have foundation sacrifices where when they're building the cornerstone to a big undertaking, they'll just slit someone's throat and push them into the foundation.
Yeah, and a lot of people think that this didn't happen in Egypt, but no, Egypt actually did engage in this kind of sacrifice. I'm pretty sure they did the foundation sacrifice.
Yeah, and then you just have your run-of-the-mill child sacrifice for fertility or whatever, or leave them outside if you don't want them. And just to wrap up real quick, so all of this is what the world looked like before Christ. So the world of BC was very barbaric. You wouldn't like it. You wouldn't survive. You would be dead. And Christ came and dethroned these things. Literally, like evangelicalism back then, it looks a lot different because you actually going into a temple and knocking down these possessed statues that people were sacrificing.
Yeah, many of the church fathers discussed this, where the idols were destroyed, and then they would convert the basilicas into Orthodox churches. Absolutely.
Right. So now you have these displaced entities that used to get so much worship and veneration, and Christ coming has dispelled. So now that they're seeking other ways to get back into contact with people. And they can do this through divination, technology.
Well, that's why we've seen a rise in all of this stuff in the last several years, as people have lost their, authentic tradition in the West. Western civilization is built on Christianity. Byzantine civilization built on Orthodox Christianity. We don't even learn about Byzantium in the West anymore. This tradition that built what we have, people are now turning away from that as we get to this sort of degradation phase of our civilization, like Spengler talked about. And the problem is that when we get to that phase, then people start returning to the irrational, to the primitive, to the primal, to these superstitions, especially amongst a lot of the Gen Z and millennials. The witchcraft and the occult, all that kind of stuff has really exploded. But there is good news. A lot of people at that age group are also becoming Orthodox Christians, are also turning to tradition and looking for authentic meaning. So I think we're kind of seeing a winnowing of the wheat from the chaff in today's zeitgeist. And thank you for tuning in.